Today, we're going to be speaking with Julia Keller, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, whose latest book is Quitting: A Life Strategy, The Myth of Perseverance, and How the New Science of Giving Up Can Set You Free. Really appreciate you being here today. I recently read the book and I'm looking forward to talking to you about it.
Oh, very nice to be here, David.
So, maybe let's just start with some of the stories that are often told about quitting and grit and perseverance. I think certainly in Western American society, for sure, there's this idea that you stick to things, you don't start things and quit them halfway. There's virtue in seeing everything through to the end, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about where those stories originate culturally?
I feel that they really began and really took hold in the culture in about the middle of the 19th century, when, as you know, that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when great fortunes were being made by a very few people at the top of the economic ladder, while most people lived in pretty terrible squalor and misery and want. And we had to find a way, we as a culture had to find a way to kind of justify this. The idea is, how do we be good people and allow this to happen? And one of the ways was to suggest that, well, it's all a matter of grit and perseverance. If you don't succeed, if you don't have a lot of money, if you don't live in a big house and have a coach and four, because this was mainly 19th century London where this really began, it meant you didn't work very hard. So we created this myth of perseverance, the idea that people at the very top of our socioeconomic ladder just worked harder and were better people. And we began to equate all of that with a kind of a moral virtue as well. And I think it was quite wrongheaded and really led us off in a very unfortunate direction.
So there are really two stories here that are interesting. There's the sort of like, more self-help, self-improvement side of this. There's the socioeconomic critique. And certainly it fits into what I guess we could say the standard capitalist bootstrap story is, if indeed success is merely about perseverance, then it becomes much easier to tell the story that if you haven't succeeded, it's because of some kind of personal failing rather than maybe a structural or systemic one. That's maybe one side of this. There's
Yes.
also questions about, hey, you know what? Sometimes it's good to be aware of the sunk cost fallacy, but to realize it doesn't make sense to keep going with a particular project. You may benefit from freeing up either your time or your resources and sort of reallocating. And maybe in many cases, quitting is actually a good thing rather than something to be
Yes.
criticized.
Yes.
Can you weave the two stories together to get us to maybe modern society's view on this?
I think that it would really benefit all of us to take this second look at quitting, as I call it, to look at it as really at the very center of the human endeavor, which is to decide when to go on and continue on a current path and when to take another path. And that's why I think that weaving the past and the kind of historical antecedent for some of these ideas with our present situation. And we see a lot of the profiles that are done, in some ways quite very positive profiles done of people who have achieved great wealth and success, always come back to this narrative of hard work. And that because the suggestion is, well, you can get that too. You too can have a $500 million yacht, as Jeff Bezos does, if only you will work hard. And when we know, of course, that isn't true at all, that there are such things as luck in the world and good luck. So I like your notion of weaving together these two concepts, because I think it would be better for all of us if we recognized that things do just happen. Some of us are born with profound social and economic and, in many cases, intellectual and emotional disabilities. People are born black or brown in this predominantly white culture, be born female. All of these things we're born with that we have to reckon with as we try to make a success of our lives. And of course, not just an economic success, but to use our gifts and talents along lines of excellence, which was the Greek definition of happiness. So I like your notion of weaving together those two. There is this the kind of backstory of capitalism, which always says that it's a matter of grit and perseverance. And if you work hard, pull up your bootstraps, you will do well. And the opposite side of that, of course, is that if you haven't done well, then it's your fault. And it's that kind of blame mongering that we often indulge in this, particularly in the current age, that really began to trouble me, which was the kind of part of the impulse for me to write this book and to explore these ideas.
It seems also that even in many of the stories that really are stories, at least kind of punctually about perseverance, it's often missing from the story the quitting that may have taken place before that last chapter, so to speak. I mean, if I were to
Yes.
tell the story of my podcast and how we grew it to what it is today, it could be a story of perseverance, but it also would be a story of a few things I first tried that didn't work and that I made the decision that it didn't make sense to continue investing time or resources in. So that's another aspect to this.
Perfect. Perfect. It's so true. I was being interviewed on another podcast, and this gentleman got very upset, very incensed at even the whole notion of quitting. And he said, "My podcast is successful because I stuck to it." And he said, "I had to try a lot of different things and I stuck to it." And I said, "Yes. And had you stayed with those things that did not work out for you, then this would not have worked out." So it depends on the perspective from which we see it. And I would maintain that the reason we don't like to see quitting as being kind of the hidden signifier of success, and one of the things that can lead to success, is because we have this grit and perseverance ethos that's kind of it's always in the background of our culture. And if you quit something, you're a loser, you're a bum, you didn't stick with it. And yet very often, as you say, the story could be told from that way around, and it would be completely different. That decision of when to change and when not to change is really at the very heart of what we do. It's at the dynamic heart of what we do as human beings.
There's an idea in some business circles about fail quickly. In other words,
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
information gathering is such that you might benefit from knowing more quickly whether something is not going to work, which seems to suggest more of an alignment maybe with what you're talking about. Something I've always tried to do when we try a new project. We recently tried a dubbed to Spanish version of this show. I'm
Mm.
from Argentina, and I thought there's some demand for this. I don't have time to redo every episode in Spanish. What if we dub the shows? We kind of calculated what's the potential audience in the US, outside of the US. We could have kind of labored over this for 6 or 12 or even longer months before we found the exact right way to test it. But my thought was, I want to test the assumptions as quickly as possible, get some data, and then bail on this if it doesn't work. And it didn't work. I mean, quite literally, the numbers just weren't there. The dubbing was too expensive. I found it to be a success to quickly be able to identify this is not a good direction to spread resources. We figured it out really quickly. We can now refocus in other areas.
Fail quickly. Yes, yes. I think that's a grand notion, because it really is true, and that sort of dovetails with the sunk cost fallacy idea. I mean, I examined some case studies in my book, like with Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes
Yep.
and WeWork and Adam Newman. That Why didn't they just quit when it became clear that this wasn't working? Why not? And I mean, you could argue that it was in their character not to quit, and I can't psychoanalyze them, but I do think that it's very hard to do that failing quickly, just as you mentioned, because there's always that fear that someone's going to say, you quit too soon.
Right.
And you quit too soon because you're lazy and you're short sighted and you just don't get it. And yet the opposite can be true. I mean, I call Thomas Edison the greatest quitter of all time. Thomas Edison knew when to stop on all those experiments. I mean, he tried 19,000 different plants. He was trying to find a synthetic rubber, and he would try again and again and again, and he knew when to quit. Had he not known when to quit, he would have been stuck in that laboratory for the next 20 years trying to make dandelions into rubber, which did not work, by the way.
You tell stories in the book also that are maybe less about a business signal that it's time to quit, like the Theranos or the WeWork stories. But you talk about gymnast Simone Biles, who famously quit the Tokyo Olympics, and the idea was it's to focus on her mental health. And it seemed, I mean, reactions were very mixed at the time that she made that decision.
Mm,
It
mm,
seems that society views, at least in Western industrialized society, quitting for mental health reasons is seemingly viewed differently in some
mm.
way, and maybe viewed more negatively. Is that true?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, there's that sort of creeping idea around the edges of weakness, of somehow you weren't able to tough it out. And I think, hasn't this past week just really certainly validated Biles's decision, the fact that she has come back stronger than ever and as
Mm.
a magnificent performance. I compare her in the book. One of the things I do is to talk about how quitting is a very natural thing in nature, and the fact that from a neuroscience perspective, quitting is one of the most important things that we do in order to keep our brain cells nimble and active and flexible. And I talk about recent experiments in neuroscience that bear that out. And in terms of biles, I compare, of course, to a honeybee. A honeybee will stand down and not sting, because stinging means death. Only the females sting, and they're eviscerated when they sting. So that honeybee has to make a pretty important decision. Is this worth my life? And the analogy I draw is Biles at the Tokyo Olympics when she decided to stand down. She knew she wasn't right. Her body didn't feel right. Her mind wasn't right. She made that decision. It was not worth the cost of her life. The same decision a honeybee makes. And then again, I think this week has just meant that, boy, was she right. She knew her body, she knew her mind, and others may have wanted to call her a quitter, and she did. I mean, there was some "you go girl," but she also came in for a great deal of criticism, particularly on Twitter and venues like that, anonymous venues. People are so bold when it's anonymous, aren't they?
Yes, they very much are. I can tell you from experience. When it comes to the decision to quit and this idea of like, is there a gut instinct, or is this something I need to run a spreadsheet on, or is it a pros and cons list? In the book, you talk about bees, you talk about other experiments with animals, circumstances that are designed essentially to frustrate different species of animals, to measure at what point, in one way, what's going on in the brain when it is that they decide to abandon. And the seed that's glued to the tabletop, they'll say, okay, I'm abandoning this one, I'm going to go for a different seed, or whatever the case may be. Is there an analogy when it comes to human quitting to some kind of a chemical release or something that we can identify? Is it a gut instinct thing? How do humans know when to quit, or do they not necessarily know?
It's all of those things. We have about 86 billion neurons, each of us, and all of those neurons are engaged in even the simplest activity. If you decide whether you're going to get the second cup of coffee today,
Right.
to deciding to quit medical school or to go to medical school, they're all involved and they're all engaged. So what we know, and of course we're at the very cusp of understanding this. As you know, neuroscience, that's a word that's thrown around all the time. But the reality is we know more than we ever have, but we still know very, very little about what happens in the brain. And we do know that there are specific chemical and electrical triggers in the brain when we make that decision to abandon one path and go on another. In our brains, the brains of crows and single-celled organisms, and dolphins and whales and gymnasts, all of us together, among those neurons. We're just at the very beginning. They're just at the very threshold of understanding that. But there are indeed those particular triggers. We know now, we generally think we know where in the brain and what happens in the brain. And the reason this is a focus of study, of course, is because of addiction studies. That's one of the major ways that this is going to be used. What makes some people sit there and pull that slot machine again and again and again and not quit? Where, say, if you and I don't have a gambling problem, why are we able to maybe put a quarter in a slot machine and then walk away? What's the difference? Why are some people able to quit? What's happening in the brain that can quit? What's happening in the brain that can't quit? And if we're able to pinpoint these chemical and electrical triggers, the idea is that perhaps we'll be able to come up with perhaps some synthetic chemicals, some pharmaceuticals that could do this, or even from a therapy perspective, we may be able to do more once we understand how the brain quits, why it quits, when it quits, how it makes that decision. To see it as a matter strictly of will and of willpower and of perseverance, we know that can't be right. And when that's often used just to denigrate and to demonize people.
In your book, and also Daniel Pink talks about this in his book about regret, if I recall correctly, it seems there's somewhat of a consensus that in general, people tend to regret not quitting more than they regret quitting overall. Am I remembering that correctly?
I think that's true in terms of his work, but certainly that's what I found in my interviews.
So when it comes to situations where people look back at decisions to quit and they feel that the decision was actually the wrong one to have quit something, do we have some sense of what the mistake was? Was it following the wrong instinct? Was it something that was happening in the brain that sent the wrong signal? Was it merely circumstance or even chance or odds or something like that when the quit decision is wrong?
That's a great question, because I'd have to say, instead of knowing it definitively, from interviews with neuroscientists and evolutionary biologists, just anecdotally from the people that I spoke with, often I think it's because it's an impulsive decision. I interviewed a physician who is in charge of physician retention at Northwestern University hospitals. His job is when physicians and other healthcare professionals want to quit, and of course, in the wake of the pandemic, that happened a lot. his job was to sit down and kind of do the exit interview right after they, the stethoscope had been thrown into the trash can. I'm out of here after that. And it was often people who didn't think beyond the quitting moment. That was what I remember him telling me, that it was quit to what? He would say, if you're going to quit, what's going to be in the next moment after that? So often I would think that it would be a kind of an emotional and impulsive decision based on a fit of pique. And then we
Mm.
all know that that rarely works out, just to say. So to be a little bit more thoughtful is generally what he would counsel people. He would never counsel somebody to not do it if they wanted to go to another field, of course. But he would say, just give it maybe a couple of minutes more thought before you do that. So maybe that impulsiveness would be, if I had to pinpoint something based on many hundreds of interviews.
That's what it would be. That is very interesting. The book is Quitting, A Life Strategy, The Myth of Perseverance, and How the New Science of Giving Up Can Set You Free. We've been speaking with the book's author, Julia Keller. Really appreciate your time and insights today.
Oh, thank you, David. I appreciate your reading of the book. I can tell you've thought a lot about these ideas as I have because they're so crucial.